Hi there. Let your mind slow down and relax your body. We aim to be calm and peaceful. And please, in the comments, write down your best help for sleeping and let me know where you are from. And never forget that you are loved and important in this world to somebody. You are unique and we love you. The Graveyard Watcher. When I was 19, I worked part-time at a cemetery near my hometown. The job was simple, mostly mowing grass, trimming hedges, and occasionally guiding visitors who were looking for specific graves. The pay wasn't great, but it was quiet, and I didn't mind the solitude. The cemetery was old, dating back to the late 1800s, and many of the gravestones were weathered and cracked. A wrought iron fence surrounded the property, and tall oak trees cast long shadows over the rows of headstones. During the day, it was peaceful, almost serene. At night, though, it felt entirely different. One evening, I stayed late to finish some landscaping near the far edge of the cemetery. The sun had just set, and a thick fog was rolling in, turning the headstones into ghostly shapes in the fading light. I was packing up my tools when I noticed something strange. A figure standing beneath one of the trees. At first, I thought it was a visitor who had stayed past closing time. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark, tattered clothes. Their head was tilted slightly, as if they were watching me. "Hey!" I called again, stepping closer. "The cemetery's closed." They didn't move. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I couldn't see their face. The shadows beneath the tree were too deep, and the figure's features seemed to blur into the darkness. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back. But I was the only one there, and it was my job to make sure the grounds were clear. I took another step forward, and the figure disappeared. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone, vanishing like smoke. My chest tightened as I scanned the area, my eyes darting between the gravestones. The fog was thicker now, curling around the trees and obscuring the path back to the maintenance shed. I hurried toward the shed, my heart pounding. As I reached the door, I heard it, faint footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I spun around, but the path was empty. The footsteps grew louder, circling me, though there was no one there. The air grew colder, and I could feel the weight of something watching me, pressing against my back. I fumbled with the key, unlocking the shed and slamming the door shut behind me. Inside, I locked the door and turned off the light, peering out through the small, grime-covered window. The cemetery was eerily silent, the fog drifting like a living thing. Then, beneath one of the oaks, I saw the figure again. They were closer this time, their head tilted even farther, their arms hanging limply at their sides. I didn't stay to see if they moved again. I waited until the footsteps stopped, then bolted to my car and sped home. The next morning, when I returned to the cemetery, everything seemed normal. No sign of the figure, no tracks in the grass. I quit a week later, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me home. Even now, when I pass by the cemetery, I feel a cold, watchful presence, and at night, when the fog rolls in, I sometimes catch glimpses of a shadowy figure standing just beyond the edge of my vision. The Disappearing Road. One summer, my friends and I decided to take a road trip through the mountains. We'd heard about a scenic route called Devil's Hollow Road, a winding path that supposedly offered breathtaking views and an eerie, abandoned town halfway up the mountain. The stories we'd read online were vague but intriguing, accounts of strange lights, ghostly figures, and cars disappearing without a trace. Naturally, we had to check it out. We set out late in the afternoon, following the GPS as it directed us onto a narrow, unmarked road. The asphalt was cracked and uneven, overgrown with weeds, and the trees on either side were so dense they blocked out most of the sunlight. The further we went, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed to avoid the area. "This place is creepy," Jess said from the passenger seat, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. "That's the point," Mark replied from the back seat, grinning. "It's supposed to be haunted." As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched across the road, and a thick mist began to rise. The GPS signal flickered, then cut out entirely, leaving us with no clear sense of direction. I slowed the car, my hands tightening on the wheel. "We'll just keep going," Mark said. "The road's got to lead somewhere." But the road didn't lead anywhere. It twisted and turned, doubling back on itself in ways that didn't make sense. The landmarks we passed, a rusted mailbox, a broken fence, a gnarled tree, started to repeat, as if we were driving in circles. "Are we lost?" Jess asked, her voice rising with tension. "No," I said, though I wasn't sure. "It's just weird." The mist thickened, swallowing the headlights, and the temperature dropped sharply. My knuckles ached from gripping the wheel, and my pulse quickened as I spotted something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. The figure didn't move. It was tall and pale, its features obscured by the mist. For a moment, we sat in stunned silence, staring at it. Then it began to walk toward us. "Go!" Jess screamed, and I floored the gas. The tires screeched as we sped forward, swerving to avoid the figure. It didn't react, didn't flinch, as we passed it. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, it was gone. The road stretched on, endless and unchanging. My stomach churned as I realized the gas gauge was dropping faster than it should have been. The landmarks continued to repeat, their familiarity now suffocating. "This isn't right," I muttered, my voice barely audible. Then the car sputtered and died. Panic set in as we climbed out, the mist enveloping us. The road was silent, the forest unnaturally still. Mark pulled out his phone, but there was no signal, no GPS, no way to call for help. "Did you hear that?" Jess whispered, her eyes wide. It started as a low hum, growing louder with each passing second. Lights appeared in the distance, bobbing through the mist like lanterns. At first I thought it was another car, but the lights moved erratically, weaving between the trees and getting closer. "Back in the car!" I yelled. We piled in, locking the doors as the light surrounded us. Shadows moved through the mist, circling the car. The hum grew deafening, drowning out our panicked breaths. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The mist cleared, the lights vanished, and the road ahead was empty. We didn't wait to see if they would return. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. We drove in silence, not speaking until we were miles away, back on the main highway. None of us ever talked about what we saw, and none of us dared to return to Devil's Hollow Road. But sometimes when I'm driving at night, I catch a glimpse of lights in the distance, weaving through the trees, and I wonder if the road is still waiting for someone else to wander too far. The shadow in the mirror. When I moved into my first apartment, it felt like a dream come true. It was small but cozy, with high ceilings and a large antique mirror mounted on the wall above the fireplace. The mirror was beautiful. Its ornate gold frame gleamed despite its age, and the glass, though slightly warped, gave the room an elegant touch. The landlord told me it came with the apartment, and since it was too heavy to move, I decided to leave it where it was. I barely gave it a second thought as I unpacked, arranging my furniture and settling in. The first few weeks were uneventful. I'd occasionally notice how the mirror distorted reflections slightly, stretching and twisting them at certain angles, but I chalked it up to the old glass. Then one evening, as I was tidying up, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow in the mirror that didn't match anything in the room. It was faint, just a dark shape near the edge of the frame, and it disappeared the moment I turned to look directly at it. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light or my overactive imagination. But the shadow came back the next night, and the night after that. At first it stayed near the edges, barely visible, but over the course of a week, it moved closer to the center of the mirror, becoming more distinct. It wasn't just a shadow. It had a shape, vaguely human, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and it was always facing me. I started avoiding the mirror, draping a sheet over it whenever I could. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, I'd wake up to the faint rustle of fabric, only to find the sheet on the floor and the mirror uncovered. One night, I decided to confront it. Armed with a flashlight, I stood in front of the mirror, staring at the warped glass. The shadow was there, clearer than ever, its head tilted as if it were studying me. My hands shook as I reached out to touch the surface. The glass was ice cold. "Who are you?" I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. The shadow didn't move, but the air in the room grew heavier, the temperature dropping sharply. My reflection wavered, and for a brief moment, I saw something that wasn't me staring back. Something with hollow eyes and a jagged, too-wide grin. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair, and the shadow vanished. The mirror returned to normal, its surface reflecting the empty room. I moved out the next morning, leaving the mirror behind. I didn't tell the landlord what happened, and I didn't take anything with me that had been near the mirror. But sometimes, when I pass by antique stores or old houses, I catch glimpses of similar mirrors and feel a chill run down my spine. And I wonder if it's still there, waiting for someone else to look too closely. The voices in the woods. My grandparents owned a cabin deep in the mountains, surrounded by dense forest. It was a beautiful place, far from any towns or highways, with no cell service and only a narrow dirt road leading to it. I spent most summers there as a kid, running through the woods and playing by the creek that wound through the trees. But there was one part of the forest I never ventured into, the northern woods. My grandparents had warned me about it since I was little. "It's easy to get lost," my grandfather would say, his tone serious. "And you might hear things out there that aren't meant for you." I didn't understand what he meant until the summer I turned 16. It was late July, and the air was thick with humidity. I was restless, tired of the same trails and familiar creeks, so I decided to explore the northern woods. I figured I was old enough to handle myself, and I'd stick close to the cabin. The trees were denser there, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was cooler, the ground soft and covered in moss. At first, it was peaceful. The only sounds the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Then I heard the voices. They were faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind. I stopped, straining to hear, but they faded into silence. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just the wind moving through the trees, and kept walking. The whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't words exactly, just sounds, low and rhythmic, like a language I couldn't understand. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I turned in a slow circle, trying to find the source. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. The forest was unnaturally quiet now, the air heavy with an almost suffocating stillness. My pulse quickened as I realized I couldn't remember which direction I'd come from. The trees all looked the same, their twisted branches forming a maze around me. I started walking, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The whispers began again, louder and more urgent, coming from every side. Shadows shifted in the corners of my vision, darting between the trees. Panic set in as I broke into a run, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the mossy ground. The voices grew louder, overlapping and echoing, filling my ears until I couldn't think. And then, ahead of me, I saw it. A clearing bathed in faint, unnatural light. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of stones, each one carved with strange, jagged symbols. The light seemed to emanate from the stones, casting long, flickering shadows across the ground. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the stones themselves. I froze, unable to move, as the shadows in the clearing began to coalesce. They took on shapes, humanoid but twisted, their limbs too long and their movements jerky. They turned toward me, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. I don't remember how I got back to the cabin. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling through the door, gasping for air. My grandfather took one look at me and shook his head. "I told you not to go there," he said, his voice heavy with something between anger and fear. "The northern woods don't let everyone come back." I never went near the northern woods again, but sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers drifting through the trees, and I wonder if they're calling me back. The room that moved. When I first moved into my apartment, it seemed perfect. It was a charming old building with high ceilings and wide windows that let in plenty of light. The landlord mentioned that the layout could be confusing. Something about renovations over the years, creating odd angles and hallways. But I didn't think much of it. The first few days were normal. I set up my furniture, unpacked my boxes, and started settling in. But then, strange things began to happen. It started small. I'd go to bed at night, only to wake up and find that my bedroom door was slightly ajar, even though I was certain I'd closed it. My keys would show up in places I didn't remember leaving them, and my furniture seemed to shift ever so slightly, though I couldn't tell if it was my imagination. Then one night, I woke up feeling disoriented. Something about the room was off. The walls seemed closer than they should have been, and the window that usually overlooked the street was gone. In its place was a blank, featureless wall. Panic bubbled in my chest as I turned on the light. The room was unfamiliar. The bed, dresser, and even the rug were the same, but everything else, the angles of the walls, the placement of the doors, was wrong. I got up and opened the door, expecting to find the hallway. Instead, I was met with another room, a living room I didn't recognize. It was furnished, but not with anything of mine. The air was cold, and the silence was oppressive. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing faintly. No response. I stepped into the room, my heart pounding. The furniture was covered in a thin layer of dust, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. There were no windows, no doors except the one I had come through. I turned to go back, but the doorway was gone. The wall was seamless, as though the door had never existed. I felt my chest tighten as I spun around, searching for any way out. Then I heard it. Faint footsteps coming from somewhere beyond the walls. They were slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. My breath hitched as I pressed myself against the wall, my pulse racing. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then, from the corner of the room, I saw something move. A shadow, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was lying in my bed, drenched in sweat, the familiar layout of my apartment surrounding me. I told myself it was just a nightmare, but the fear lingered. The next day, I noticed something strange. The window in my bedroom had moved. It was smaller now, shifted slightly to the left. The walls seemed closer, the angles sharper. And every night since, I've woken up to find myself in a different version of my apartment, each one more distorted than the last. I don't know what's happening, but I'm afraid one day I'll wake up in a room with no way out. The forgotten door. My grandparents' house was a sprawling old mansion filled with creaky floors, hidden passageways, and rooms that seemed to change purpose every time I visited. As a child, I loved exploring it, convinced there were secret treasures or hidden worlds waiting just behind the next door. There was one door, though, that my grandparents never let me open. It was in the basement, tucked away in the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of old furniture. The door was plain and unremarkable, painted the same dull beige as the walls, but it was locked with a heavy iron padlock. "What's in there?" I asked once, pointing at the door. "Nothing you need to worry about," my grandfather said, his tone unusually stern. "It's just storage." His answer only fueled my curiosity. Every time I visited, I'd sneak down to the basement, staring at the locked door and imagining what might be behind it. I tried picking the lock once, but the iron was old and rusted, the keyhole too complex for my clumsy attempts. Years later, after my grandparents passed away, the house was left to me. By then, I'd mostly forgotten about the door, until the day I started cleaning out the basement. As I moved the furniture and boxes, I found myself face to face with it once again. The padlock was still there, but the wood around it had weakened with age. It wouldn't take much to force it open. Gripping a crowbar, I pried at the lock. The wood splintered with a loud crack, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A cold draft wafted up, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something metallic. I hesitated, but curiosity won out. I grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air grew colder as I went, the light from above fading until I was surrounded by darkness. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, stone-walled room. The floor was dirt, damp and uneven, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with jars. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight over the shelves. The jars were filled with strange objects, bones, feathers, and what looked like preserved organs suspended in cloudy liquid. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it was a large, ornate box. The wood was dark and polished, carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift in the flashlight's beam. My hands trembled as I reached out to open it. Before I could lift the lid, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. The air grew heavy, and a low, guttural whisper filled the room, rising and falling in an unintelligible chant. The light from my flashlight flickered, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, darting just beyond the beam of light. I bolted up the stairs, pounding on the door until it flew open. The basement was silent, the air still. I locked the door behind me and never went back down. The house was sold shortly after, and I never told the new owners about the door. But sometimes late at night, I dream of that dark room and the whispering shadows, and I wonder if they're still waiting for someone to come back. The room behind the curtain. It had been a quiet start to the day at the hotel, the kind of quiet that always felt a little too still, like the air was holding its breath. I had been working as a healthcare assistant for a while, living in a small detached rental far away from my dad's home. It was a lonely stretch of countryside with just one neighbor, Jake. Jake had helped me move in when I first arrived. He was in his late 30s, always polite, always smiling, always present. Too present. At first I appreciated his friendliness. Living alone, it was nice to have someone to chat with. We bonded over music, and he often stopped by to talk about our shared love of Tool and playing bass. But it wasn't long before Jake's visits began to feel less like friendly neighborly chats and more like intrusions. One evening, I came home to find a basket of flowers on my doorstep. It was a thoughtful gesture, or so I thought. Attached was a card. From Jake, hope you like them. Come by to say hi. That same night, there was a knock at my door. It was Jake. I wanted to see if you liked the flowers, he said, his voice soft but persistent. They're lovely, thank you, I replied, keeping my hand firmly on the doorframe. He lingered there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Do you have a minute? I thought maybe we could talk. I hesitated. It was late, and something about his demeanor put me on edge. I'm really tired, I said finally. Maybe tomorrow? His smile faltered just for a second, but the flash of something darker in his eyes made my stomach churn. Sure, he said, stepping back. Tomorrow, then. The next morning, he was waiting for me outside my door. Coffee? He asked, holding up 2 cups like a peace offering. I reluctantly agreed, figuring it was better to keep things polite. We walked to a nearby cafe, and as we sipped our drinks, Jake's demeanor shifted again. I like you, he blurted out suddenly. I mean, I really like you. I froze, unsure how to respond. That's sweet, I said cautiously. But I'm not looking for a relationship. His expression hardened. For a moment, I thought he might snap right there in the middle of the cafe. But instead, he muttered something under his breath, grabbed his cup, and left without another word. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. That night I came home to find him sitting on my doorstep. Jake, I said firmly, what are you doing here? "I wanted to talk," he replied, standing as I approached. "I think you owe me an explanation." "I don't owe you anything," I said, my voice shaking. "You need to leave." His face twisted into a sneer. "You're just like the rest of them," he spat. "Ungrateful, selfish." Fear prickled at the back of my neck as I stepped backward, fumbling for my keys. "Leave, Jake," I repeated, trying to sound braver than I felt. He didn't move. I managed to unlock the door and slip inside, slamming it shut just as he stepped forward. Through the peephole, I saw him standing there, his fists clenched at his sides. The harassment escalated after that. Flowers and notes left on my doorstep. Phone calls at all hours of the night. I even caught him waiting for me in the parking lot at work. Each time, I told him to stop. Each time, he ignored me. One night, I woke up to a noise in the kitchen. My heart raced as I reached for my phone. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. I barely had time to react before a shadowy figure appeared in my doorway. It was Jake. I froze, my mind scrambling for a plan. He stood there, his face partially obscured by the darkness, but I could see the glint of something in his hand. "Jake," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You need to leave." He took a step closer and I bolted. I grabbed my phone and climbed out the window, sprinting barefoot across the lawn to my car. As I drove away, I looked back and saw him standing in the kitchen window, watching me with a sinister grin. The police found no signs of forced entry, and Jake denied everything. Without concrete evidence, they couldn't do much. But that night was enough for me. I packed my things and moved back in with my dad the next day. I still don't know how Jake got inside that night, but sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain that I hear footsteps just outside my bedroom door. The horse ranch of nowhere. The Caribbean sun beat down on the vibrant streets of Aruba as my wife and I strolled along, hand in hand, savoring the warm air and the freedom of our honeymoon. The days were idyllic. Our mornings spent lounging on white sand beaches, and our afternoons wandering through downtown, where the rhythm of calypso music floated from every corner. We were in paradise. On our third day, we saw the sign. It hung just outside one of the larger hotels, its bold letters advertising free horseback riding excursions. A catch, of course. There always was one. To earn the vouchers, we'd have to sit through a timeshare presentation. My wife and I exchanged a glance, then shrugged. It was a small price to pay for an experience we'd never forget. Or so we thought. The timeshare presentation was as tedious as expected, full of glossy brochures and pushy salespeople. But true to their word, they handed us 2 vouchers as we walked out the door, the promise of an adventure waiting on the horizon. The day of the excursion arrived, and we stood outside our hotel, waiting for the company's van to pick us up. When it pulled in, I felt the first pang of unease. It was old, battered and scratched, with faded paint peeling from its sides. The driver stepped out, his weathered face breaking into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You ready?" he asked, motioning us inside. As we climbed into the van, I couldn't help but notice the state of the interior. The upholstery was torn, the dashboard lit up with warning lights, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. My wife caught my eye, her expression mirroring my hesitation. But we were already inside, and the driver was pulling out of the lot. The drive took us far from the bustling tourist areas, the paved roads giving way to dirt paths. Civilization faded behind us, replaced by stretches of barren land and clusters of cacti. The van rattled violently with every bump, the engine groaning as if it might give out at any moment. After nearly an hour, we arrived at the so-called ranch. It wasn't what I'd pictured. There was no welcoming sign, no horses grazing in the distance, just an empty clearing with a small, dilapidated house and a shed that looked ready to collapse. "Where are the other riders?" my wife asked as we stepped out of the van. "It's just you two today," the driver said, his grin widening. "Private tour." A chill ran down my spine. The solitude of the place, once appealing, now felt suffocating. The man led us to the shed, motioning for us to wait while he got everything ready. As he disappeared around the corner, I peered into the shed. My stomach dropped. It was empty. "Where are the horses?" I whispered to my wife, trying to keep my voice steady. She shook her head, her unease now matching my own. "I don't know, but we need to leave." The man returned a moment later, his hands in his pockets. "You ready?" he asked. "Actually," I said quickly, "my wife isn't feeling well. We should head back." His smile faltered, and for a moment, his eyes darkened. Then he shrugged. "Sure, no problem. Let's get you back in the van." Relief washed over me as we climbed into the vehicle, but when he turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. "Out of gas," he muttered, shaking his head. He pulled out a cell phone and began speaking rapidly in Spanish, his tone growing more agitated with each word. "What's he saying?" my wife whispered. I didn't know, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out of that van. "We're walking back," I said, grabbing her hand. The man stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing. "It's a long way," he said, his voice carrying an edge. "You're better off waiting. Someone's coming with gas." "We'll be fine," I replied firmly, stepping out of the van. My wife and I started down the dirt road, our pace quickening with every step. I could feel his eyes on us, watching as we disappeared over the horizon. The walk back was grueling. The heat bore down on us, and the road stretched endlessly ahead. We had no idea where we were going, only that we needed to put as much distance as possible between us and the ranch. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a small house. A man sat on the porch, a taxi parked in the driveway. He looked up as we approached, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Can you take us back to the city?" I asked, desperation seeping into my voice. The man nodded, sensing the urgency in my tone. He didn't ask questions as we climbed into the taxi, and I was grateful for his silence. When we finally reached our hotel, I felt a weight lift from my chest. We reported the incident to the front desk, only to be met with indifference. "We don't work with that company," the clerk said with a shrug. "That's why we recommend booking through us." That night, as we lay in bed, my wife turned to me. "What do you think they were planning?" she asked. I didn't have an answer, but the thought haunted me. Had we narrowly escaped something sinister? Was the gas really out, or had it been part of some twisted plan? We left Aruba 2 days later, the memory of the ranch lingering like a shadow. To this day, I can't think about that trip without feeling a shiver of unease. The longest walk. It was supposed to be a peaceful afternoon. My cousin and I had set out on a walk to enjoy the summer breeze, leaving behind the commotion of a family gathering at my aunt's house. The air was warm, the kind of sticky humidity that clings to your skin, but the shaded sidewalks offered some relief. I was only 12 or 13 at the time, with my cousin a few years older at 16. I always looked up to her, trusting her to guide me when things felt uncertain. The plan was simple. No destination, just wandering. As we strolled along the residential streets, her idea shifted. Let's walk to Aunt Maria's apartment. It's just a little further. I hesitated. Something about the idea didn't sit right with me. The sun was already starting to dip, and Aunt Maria's place was in a different neighborhood entirely. But my cousin brushed off my concern, saying we'd be fine. She was older, wiser, and I wanted to believe her. So we kept walking. Block after block, the houses thinned out, replaced by empty lots and patches of overgrown grass. The air seemed heavier, the streets quieter. By the time we crossed a small bridge overlooking a narrow creek, the sun was a vibrant orange smear on the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows. As we paused to catch our breath, a man appeared. He was at the far end of the street, just a vague figure at first, blending into the dimming light. I wouldn't have thought twice about him if he hadn't stopped dead in his tracks and turned toward us. "Hey!" His voice boomed, shattering the stillness. It wasn't a friendly greeting. It was sharp, commanding. He raised his arm, pointing straight at us. "You!" My cousin and I froze, exchanging panicked glances. Then, as if on cue, the man began sprinting toward us. Not walking, not jogging, sprinting. "Run!" My cousin screamed, grabbing my arm. The adrenaline hit instantly. My legs burned as we bolted down the street, weaving around parked cars and trash bins. The sound of his heavy footsteps echoed behind us, growing louder with each passing second. He was fast, impossibly fast, and gaining on us. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. His face was twisted in a sickening mix of rage and determination, his arms pumping furiously. My cousin yanked me toward a side street. "This way," she panted. The turn bought us a few seconds, but the man wasn't far behind. The neighborhood was a labyrinth of narrow alleys and overgrown yards, and every shadow felt like it could hide another threat. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. As we rounded another corner, we saw it. Aunt Maria's apartment complex. It was just a block away, its pale brick walls and flickering porch lights like a beacon of safety. But we weren't there yet. "We're almost there," my cousin gasped, her grip on my wrist tightening. We darted across the street, nearly tripping over a cracked section of sidewalk. My lungs burned. My legs screamed for rest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The man's footsteps were deafening now, so close I swore I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. We reached the apartment gate, my cousin fumbling with the latch as I kept watch. The man was still there, standing at the corner, his chest heaving. His eyes were wild, scanning the area like a predator searching for its prey. Then he stepped forward. "Get in!" my cousin hissed, finally managing to open the gate. We scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind us. There was no lock, no real barrier between us and him, but it was something. We crouched behind a cluster of bushes near the apartment's front steps, holding our breath. The man approached the gate, his footsteps slow and deliberate now. He reached out, gripping the metal bars. His fingers curled around them tightly, the veins in his hands bulging. He stared directly into the yard, his eyes scanning the shadows. I thought I was going to throw up. Seconds dragged into minutes as we stayed perfectly still, afraid that even the slightest movement would give us away. Finally, the man muttered something under his breath and turned back toward the street. He walked away slowly at first, then picked up speed until he disappeared around the corner. We didn't move. Not until we were absolutely certain he was gone. Even then, it took every ounce of courage to stand up and knock on Aunt Maria's door. When she answered, she took one look at our pale faces and trembling bodies and pulled us inside without a word. We tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled, incoherent. All we could do was sit there, clutching each other, as the reality of what we'd just escaped sank in. To this day, I don't know what that man wanted or why he chased us so relentlessly. But I'll never forget the sound of his footsteps or the look in his eyes when he reached that gate. It's a memory that lingers in the back of my mind, a reminder that danger can find you even in the quietest corners of the world. The silent passenger. It was a long, monotonous drive along the I-10. The kind of drive where the road stretches endlessly before you, and the landscape blurs into a repetitive pattern of trees, fields, and the occasional billboard. I was on my way back from visiting family, my car packed with little more than a duffel bag, some snacks, and a playlist I had played one too many times. The drive should have been uneventful. It should have been forgettable. But instead, it became something I'll never be able to forget. I first noticed the Prius when it slid into my blind spot. It was an unremarkable car, a pale silver gray that seemed to blend into the haze of the highway. I didn't think much of it at first. People drive in your blind spot all the time, right? But as the miles ticked by, the Prius stayed exactly where it was. It didn't pass me, didn't fall back, just lingered there. After a while, I started to feel uneasy. I slowed down slightly, expecting the Prius to overtake me. Instead, it matched my speed, staying stubbornly at my side. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us. Again, it matched me. I glanced over, trying to catch a glimpse of the driver. The windows were tinted just dark enough to obscure whoever was inside. I couldn't see a thing. The car itself looked clean but lived in. The kind of car you'd expect a commuter to have. But something about its behavior was off. I decided to try another tactic. I eased into the right lane, preparing to exit at the next ramp. The Prius followed. My unease turned into outright alarm. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. Whoever was driving that car was tailing me. I got off the freeway and pulled into a gas station, hoping they would drive past. But as I parked at the pump and got out of my car, I saw the Prius glide into the lot, parking at the far end. The engine idled, the car facing me like a predator sizing up its prey. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the gas pump. I couldn't stay here, exposed, with nothing but a thin stretch of asphalt between me and that car. I filled the tank as quickly as I could, avoiding eye contact with the darkened windows of the Prius. When I climbed back into my car, I felt the weight of its gaze on me. I pulled out of the lot and back onto the road, my heart pounding in my chest. The Prius followed. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I was overreacting. Maybe they just happened to be going the same way. Maybe it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel the intensity of their attention, like a physical presence pressing down on me. The miles stretched on and the Prius stayed with me. It didn't matter if I sped up or slowed down, if I switched lanes or took detours. It was always there, a silent, unyielding shadow. Finally, I decided to confront them. I maneuvered my car to force them into the left lane beside me, where I could get a clear look at them. As I glanced over, my breath caught in my throat. There were two people in the car, a man in the passenger seat and a woman behind the wheel. They both stared at me, their expressions twisted into something I can only describe as hatred. The man's eyes were wild, his lips curled into a sneer. He made a gesture, tapping his temple with one finger before drawing it across his throat in a slow, deliberate motion. I felt a surge of icy fear. Whoever these people were, they weren't just following me. They were targeting me. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, pushing my car to its limits. The engine roared as I shot down the highway, weaving between cars and trying to put as much distance as possible between me and the Prius. For a while, I thought I had lost them. Then I saw them again. They were waiting on the shoulder of the road, their car positioned to merge seamlessly into traffic as I passed. My stomach twisted into knots as they pulled out behind me, closing the gap in seconds. I couldn't do this anymore. I needed help. I spotted an upcoming exit with a rest area and veered toward it. The Prius didn't follow this time. Instead, it sped past, disappearing into the night. I pulled into the rest area and parked near the entrance, where the lot was brightly lit and several trucks were parked. For a long time I just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my eyes scanning every car that passed. I waited, half expecting the Prius to appear again, but it never did. Eventually, I got back on the road, my nerves frayed, but my determination to get home stronger than ever. I didn't see the Prius again for the rest of the drive, but the memory of those two faces, their eyes filled with malice, stayed with me. Even now, years later, I can't help but glance over my shoulder every time I see a silver Prius on the road. It's a reminder that some dangers don't announce themselves with fanfare. They linger in the shadows, silent and persistent, until the moment they decide to strike.